June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in one of the most significant military operations in history. Behind the scenes of this colossal invasion was something far less dramatic, but no less critical. Fuel, the lifeblood of modern warfare. How do you supply millions of gallons of fuel to an army on the move across an ocean, through enemy territory, under constant threat? Well, the British, with enormous help, as ever, from her allies, had a plan. And it was called Operation Pluto. After the beach landings, Allied troops needed to push inland fast, but they needed petrol, trucks, tanks, aircraft. All needed a constant supply of fuel. Tankers were slow, vulnerable to attack, and the ports were either destroyed or heavily contested. The challenge: how to keep the war machine moving. The answer: don't ship it, pipe it. Winston Churchill approved a top-secret engineering plan to lay fuel pipelines underneath the English Channel. The operation was codenamed Pluto. Pipeline under the ocean. A bold idea, never before attempted on such a scale, and shrouded in secrecy. However, Operation Pluto wasn't just technically ambitious, it was dangerously experimental. Laying pipelines under wartime conditions came with massive risks. Specialized ships towing massive pipe-laying drums, nicknamed conundrums, had to maintain a constant, slow speed in unpredictable seas. They were highly vulnerable to German U-boats, naval mines, and enemy aircraft. Any deviation in course could cause a pipe to twist, snap, or be lost entirely. In fact, several early attempts failed. On one occasion, an entire pipeline snapped during deployment and had to be abandoned. Weather conditions were so bad during another mission that a conundrum came dangerously close to capsizing. These failures weren't widely reported at the time, but behind the scenes, they were known simply as the Operation Pluto incidents. These setbacks slowed progress and demanded immediate, new anchoring systems, flexible pipe materials, and different deployment strategies. Despite the failures and setbacks, engineers pushed forward, undeterred. They weren't just laying pipe, they were rewriting the rule book of military logistics. At the head of the operation were some of Britain's brightest minds. Lord Louis Mountbatten pushed the strategy. Sir William Fraser led the Petroleum Warfare Department. Arthur Hartley, from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, was the engineer who turned concept into reality, and Sir Harold Smith helped design a flexible pipe based on telegraph cables that could stretch across the ocean floor. They developed two pipe types, the HAIS cable, flexible and lead-lined, and the Hamel pipe, rigid, steel-based. Huge floating drums were designed to unwind these pipes onto the seabed, towed by ships across the channel. One line went from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, codenamed Bambi. Another, shorter one, ran from Dungeness to Boulogne, codenamed Dumbo. To avoid detection, pumping stations were disguised as cottages, seaside cafes, even ice cream parlors. Engineers worked under threat of aerial reconnaissance and surprise attack. This was no ordinary engineering project, it was a covert military operation. The sea was calm, for now, but it was the kind of calm that made men twitchy, too still, too quiet. Aboard the HMS Latimer, one of the ships tasked with laying the Pluto pipeline, the deck groaned under the weight of a massive steel drum, the Conundrum. 60 feet tall and coiled with miles of fuel pipe, it looked more like something from a mad inventor's lab than a naval operation, and in many ways, it was. To the men crewing this mission, the job was clear. Lay fuel lines across the English Channel without dying in the process. Each operation began the same way: silence, preparation, then tension so thick you could cut it. The ship had to maintain a constant speed of just a few knots. No zigzagging, no evasive maneuvers. Once they started unwinding the pipe, they were committed. A floating target, creeping across the most heavily patrolled waters in Europe. "Once the pipe's going over," one seaman said, "we're at the mercy of the sea and the enemy." There were no guns mounted on the conundrums, no armor, no air cover guaranteed. The channel was still an active war zone, with German U-boats lurking beneath and fighter planes, always on the lookout for an easy target. One night, about halfway across to Cherbourg, the men heard it, the unmistakable thud of distant artillery followed by the high-pitched whistle of something fast. "A dive bomber!" someone shouted. Sirens blared, and the crew scrambled, but they couldn't break course. Not for anything. The conundrum had to keep turning, the pipe had to keep laying, or the whole section would kink, collapse, and ruin the mission. They had one anti-aircraft gun, manned by a wiry corporal from Sheffield, who hadn't slept in 2 days. He fired blind into the sky, tracer rounds stitching the clouds. The bomber peeled off. To this day, no one knows for sure why, but most likely was either hit or dissuaded by the Sheffield corporal. This time, they were lucky. That wasn't always the case, however. Another ship, the HMS Persephone, wasn't so lucky. She hit a mine just 12 miles off the French coast. The explosion tore through the starboard side, sending a chunk of pipe spiraling into the sea. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the mission was aborted. The pipeline had to be cut, sealed, and started again. The worst part wasn't always the enemy. It was the waiting. Hours crawling along the water, staring at the horizon, knowing that one blip on the sonar or one shadow in the sky could change everything. And still, the pipe went out, coil by coil, mile by mile. At night, they took turns manning the pumps, checking the pressure, eating lukewarm rations, and writing letters home they didn't know if they would send. But when they reached shore, when the final length of pipe snaked up onto French soil, there was no fanfare, there were no medals, just a nod from the captain and the words they'd waited forever to hear. Pipeline is holding, fuel is flowing. They knew then what few others would. They weren't just laying pipe, they were laying lifelines. For every Allied tank that rolled through France, every jeep that crossed a bridge, every Spitfire that refueled in the field, a part of them was there. Meanwhile, back in the English countryside, another operation was unfolding. In the village of Eakring, Nottinghamshire, oil was being quietly extracted from beneath British soil. It wasn't much by global standards, but every barrel helped, especially during wartime. To help ramp up production, 42 US oilmen from Standard Oil of California were secretly brought to Britain in 1943. They had a reputation of high experience coupled with the grit and determination of seasoned oil workers. They drilled over 100 wells, training British crews and boosting output. Their work fed into the pipelines and helped power the Allied advance. As is so often the case, behind the upper-ranking names were thousands of unsung heroes: the engineers, the pipe layers, the pump operators, the soldiers guarding installations, the sailors who manned the slow, vulnerable pipe-laying ships. These lower-ranking service members played a vital role, and did so without fanfare or recognition. Their bravery, grit, and skill were what turned a wild idea into a wartime success. By the end of the war, Operation Pluto had pumped over 180 million gallons of fuel to Allied forces in Europe. It didn't replace tankers entirely, but it provided a lifeline when it was most needed, right after D-Day, when every drop counted. Today, few remember Operation Pluto or the oil fields of Eakring, but in those cables beneath the channel, and those drills sunk deep into British soil, lived the resolve of an entire generation. Engineers, roughnecks, soldiers, sailors, aircrew, and others, all playing their part in laying the pipeline to victory. Thanks for listening to Unadjusted Facts. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a comment. It helps us enormously. And please join us next time as we bring you more unadjusted facts, covering a variety of fascinating topics.